All right, on the previous video, I asked you to listen to and analyze the Chopin Mazurka Opus 7, number 1, and that this is an example of a 5-part song form. So, if you would please just open up a tab that then pulls up the score for this work. You'll see that it is in the key of B flat major, and that this is a pretty clear example of 5-part song form. So I already talked about the phrase construction of part 1, and so you have 2 6-measure phrases, and you have that technique of dissolution at the end of the first phrase. And then that motive from measure 4, which is used to extend the second phrase there, the second system, the 4th and 5th measures. And so you also have a contrasting second phrase, so that would be A and then B, and that is then repeated. So you have a written out repeat of that contrasting period. So let's listen to that. Sequence. Second phrase, there's that little motive, extends it. Part 2, second phrase. So part 2 is only 2 phrases in length. The phrases are parallel and very similar. It's just that second phrase is slightly embellished. And then it leads into a restatement of part 1. So that restatement equals part 3. So part 3 starts there at the a tempo, second to last system of the first page. And then when that is restated, there's not a written out repeat of it, but instead you have the 12 measures. And that is going to lead to a repeat of parts 2 and 3. Okay? So here is the return of part 1. So this is the part 3 in the song form. Second phrase. Repeat part 2, second phrase. Part 3 is repeated. Now, when we get to this point, then this is the 4th part, the 4th overall section. And at this point, then, you see that it shifted keys. So part 2 had shifted to the key of F major. So you have E naturals through the whole section. So that is in the dominant key. And then part 3 returns to B flat to a tonic key when that opening part comes back. All right, so here part 4 at the top of page 62. Where it's marked pianissimo and sotto voce. One thing that you see in the left hand is that repeated drone bass. It's something that gives it kind of a folk-like quality. And you have this gypsy scale that is being used, which has that raised 4th step. And so that is something that gives it kind of an exotic quality. And this is something which, the two phrases are very parallel, just like part 2, where it's just the last measure of each phrase, that's slightly different. But that bass line drops down a half step from G flat and D flat, then finally to F and C. And then that returns the opening again. So that would be part 5. All right, let's listen to this part 4 section. That's the second phrase. So parallel period. Second phrase. Here's the extension. Part 4 is repeated. Okay, so that's a clear example of 5-part song form, and that's one in which part 4 is completely new material. All right, the second one I asked you to listen to was the Mendelssohn example, and I asked you to identify the return of the opening part. So each time it returns, then you'll identify that as part 3. And then if it returns, which it does again at the end, that would be part 5, if that 4th section is not a repetition of part 2. So this spinning song is one that is a little bit more complicated than the Chopin mazurka that we just did. So if you will now click on that score and bring that up, you'll see that that is listed there as page 8 out of 18 of this particular PDF file. And so if you'll go to that, you'll see that it says, number 34 on the left, and then Opus 67, number 4, for a designation of when this was published. So it's written presto, and then above that in parenthesis, that is just a spinning song, and it has to do with the general nature of this chromatic little motive that you hear. Now, one thing that I want to mention is that composers very often will use similar material in auxiliary members. So this one it starts with a 2-measure simple introduction. So this is the first one that we've looked at that has a simple introduction. And that chromatic spinning figure is something then that returns as retransition material. And you're going to hear that a couple of times. And so it's a linking motive that then brings back the opening in a similar way that you hear at the beginning. So at the beginning, that 2-measure simple introduction leads straight away into part 1 with the upbeat to the 3rd measure. So that's one thing that you can have just as a general idea. And we're going to look at one more Chopin prelude, which is another one that's a little bit more complicated, but it'll be a good one to talk about. And that has returning material that then is associated with the auxiliary members. So, all right. So it starts with a 2-measure simple introduction, and then what happens is you have 4-measure phrase lengths in this. The second phrase begins at the very last 8th note of the second system, and this has a half cadence at the end of part one. So part one concludes at the end of that first measure of the fourth system. Okay, so that much is part one, and hopefully that's what you heard, return. Now when it returns, what Mendelssohn does is he adds an extra phrase to it each time it comes back. So the first time you hear it here, it's just two phrases in length. It's a parallel period, but we're going to hear three phrases then in part three, and then you're going to hear four phrases in part five. Okay, so let's listen to this opening. Okay, so that was part one. So you had the two measure simple introduction, and then you have 8 measures, which is 2 parallel phrases, and so you have a parallel period for part one. Okay, now we're going to have the second part. And a lot of times, so when you first heard this, I mean, things go by so fast, and you've got to remember that these parts can be pretty short. That you didn't know exactly, you know, if that was the end or not. But, you know, the thing that you do the first time when you listen to these short little character pieces is listen for the return of the opening. And that is going to tell you where the end of the second part will be. And then you can kind of work your way backwards to figure out that, okay, well, what makes sense? How is this, you know, treated later in the character piece? And so forth. Then kind of work your way, you know, kind of from the back. All right, so if you go back, we're looking at the score here. Then this is a second part that begins on the upbeat to the second measure of the fourth system of the first page. And you have then 4 measures. It's really a semiphrase. So that is repeated then where you see the sforzando on the 5th system. And then that is shifted up and is sequenced again. And it goes then to you know, some related keys. And what we're going to hear is that this at the bottom of the page takes the last measure, so that last measure is going to be a repetition of the previous measure, and then you're going to hear that 2 more times. And so he's going to take the last 4 measures of the first page is the second phrase, but he extends it on the top of the second page by repeating that material 2 more times, and is going down by step. And so that second phrase is extended with that technique of dissolution again. So again, that's just repeating the end of the phrase and sequencing that and extending the length of that phrase. So you have a 6 measure second phrase there. And then on the second page, the end of that top system where it's marked piano, then you have a third phrase. And so this is one where it's like, you know, and one thing I might mention too is that within each of the parts, you can start over with the small case letter, you know. Instead of doing like, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G through the whole piece, you could just say, for that part 2, that it would be A, and then it would be A prime, and then it would be B. So part 2 is a phrase group, and it has a 6 measure second phrase. And then what happens is on the 3rd system of the second page, then it cadences on dominant. So that has taken you to G major, and it brings back then the spinning material. And so that then is an auxiliary member that is going to take you back to the return of the opening. So, because it's a connecting passage that returns to the opening material that you've already heard, then that would be a retransition. So that retransition is 5 measures long, and you have quite a bit of repetition in this. And you see where the left hand goes up an octave for the last 2 measures. Yeah, a little over 2 measures. Okay, and then that brings back the third part, or brings back the opening material, which would indicate part 3. One general thing that I want to say is that a general technique is that you're always going to compare the way the opening material returns. So whether it's in a song form like this, or if it is in like a rondo, a longer movement, always compare the way that that opening theme comes back later in the movement. And you can expect that it will be embellished. The composer won't just have a literal repetition, but will change it somewhat. So that's typical. So as I mentioned, this opening idea comes back at the end of the 4th system. The first time we heard it, it was 2 phrases in length. And so this gives you the first phrase, and then the second phrase is something that is different. And so you have return of the opening phrase, so that would be A, and then the last line of that second page is the second phrase, and that takes you through the first measure of the 3rd page, and so that would be B. And then you have a final phrase that is 4 measures in length, and this is going to lead to an authentic cadence there on the downbeat of the second measure, second line of that 3rd page. Okay, so we're going to listen to that much, to parts 2, and then you'll hear the spinning passage, that is the retransition, to part 3, and then you'll hear how the first phrase comes back, but then the second phrase is different, and then it has an additional 3rd phrase, so part 3 is a phrase group. Okay, right there. That then begins part 4. And the thing that you want to hear is that that is a return of the part 2 material. Only now this is transposed into a minor key. And therefore, this is one of those situations where part 4 is related to the thematic material of part 2, but it's a transposed return, therefore you're going to call this a 5-part song form. So this is an example of that situation. And looking at that score, this is in the key of A minor when part 4 begins, where I just stopped it. And then it shifts to the key of D minor, and you have the same dissolution technique to extend the second phrase. And then the third